Good evening, welcome, thank you all for coming. Tonight we're going to have a lecture by Henry Chalfant that we've been working on very hard at CASAR and with the help of the Mellon Foundation to bring him and to bring his wife Kathy Chalfant, two of the most extraordinary sort of contemporary arts figures in the United States. It's very fortuitous. A wonderful opportunity, and I'll introduce Henry in 1 second, but since you all are here, my name is Robert Myers. I'm the director now of the Center for American Studies and Research, and I just want to tell you about a couple of other events that are upcoming. As those of you who have been attending these events know, three of the areas that we have focused on at the Center for American Studies and Research are Middle East, U.S., which was begun under the previous director, Patrick McGreevy, and makes very obvious sense. This year we've also introduced a focus on the arts, and quite obviously we have two very interesting artistic figures here. And something else that we'll be doing is religion and comparative religion. On December the 6th, Sam Hazelby, who is our visiting professor at CASAR, will be giving a lecture which is entitled Songs of the Nation, the Origins of the American Missions Movement. That's on December 6th. We've had to juggle it around because of the holiday. There's a holiday on the 7th. It was originally scheduled, whatever. So there seems to be a little confusion about the date. It is December 6th, which is next Monday. And it will be in College Hall next Monday. Day after tomorrow, Kathy Chalfant will give a talk entitled Adventures Theatrical and Political, and sometimes both. We're also co-sponsoring a talk with the Fine Arts Department and Thomas Kim on a Native American ethnomusicologist. I have to check the date. I believe it's December the 15th. And then Martin Puchner, who is from Harvard, who is editing the Norton Anthology of World Literature, will be giving a talk, that's December 21st, on world literature, research paradigm, or pedagogical tool. Just a couple of things so you'll know the kinds of things that we are doing in the spring. Usama Makdisi will be here to talk about his new book, Faith Misplaced. Bill DiGennaro, who's a Fulbright scholar attached to English, will be talking about English in Dearborn and Beirut. We just got an email from Bernadine Dorn and Bill Ayers about the possibility of their coming, two of the members of the Weather Underground, very important political figures that were actually part of the Obama election. Became a huge issue. And Michael Miles, who's a banjo impresario. So those are some of the things that we'll be doing in the spring. We're enormously pleased and grateful to have both Kathy Chalfant and Henry Chalfant here. The events, we have a couple of events with them, and I'm saving this for last because I've told you everything that's going to happen until May. So let me kind of go back. Again, Kathy's talk is day after tomorrow. It will be here also on political theater and theater in general and her career in the theater. She's also at LAU tomorrow going to give a theater workshop that's open to the public from 3 to 5 p.m. at LAU's Irwin Theater. Tomorrow night, Henry will be screening two of his films, one called Style Wars, and I'm going to let him tell you what these films are. Style Wars, and the other is called 10 Days on the West Bank. Yes, is that the right title? Fascinating and very different perspectives on this phenomenon of street art that he'll be talking about tonight. So there are plenty of events. The other thing that we're doing with the Mellon Foundation and the architecture department is that on Saturday we're actually going to go with the film crew and document street art here in Beirut. which is a wonderful project. Again, Mellon Foundation has given money to AV to involve students in projects having to do with the arts. So we're so happy to have, Lena Raidi and architects helped to put this project together, and Sylvia Shorta. We're very happy.
Graphic design.
I'm sorry?
Graphic design.
Oh, I'm sorry. Excuse me. Mishna Sishi. Sorry. Excuse me. And now I'd like to introduce Henry. Henry Chalfant studied at Stanford, where he majored in classical Greek. Later he pursued a career as a sculptor. I believe this is him as a sculptor in Barcelona. Exhibiting his work in New York and Europe. In the 80s, he turned to photo and film documentation in order to do an in-depth study of hip-hop culture and graffiti art. Exhibits of his photos include the OK Paris Gallery and the landmark New York New Wave show at PS1, and important galleries and museums in Europe. His photos are in the collections of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York, and the Carnegie Institute in Pittsburgh. He has co-authored the definitive account of New York graffiti art, Subway Art, 1984, and a sequel on the art form's worldwide diffusion, Spray Can Art, 1987. He co-produced and did the background research and photo documentation for the film Style Wars, first shown on PBS in 1984. One of the foremost authorities on New York subway art, he has published articles and lectured extensively on this and other aspects of urban youth culture. His photographs record hundreds of ephemeral original artworks that have long since vanished. He continues to make documentary films about urban popular culture. Henry Chalfant.
Thank you, Robert. And thank you, CASAR and American University in Beirut for inviting me over. Thank you all for coming. Here, to begin with, is my career as a sculptor. In 1967, we were in Barcelona, and I was studying with a Catalan sculptor. And my wife was pregnant with our first child, as you see from the anatomically correct rotund stomach on the female character there. We decided to move to New York to be at the center of the universe, the art universe, and I, more or less segued into being a modernist sculptor. I was making objects. This is in stone. It's a limestone piece. This is a piece in marble. I was out of place in New York in the 70s doing this kind of sculpture, where the world had moved on and modernism had evolved into deciding that truth to materials was something ordered at the foundry or the quarry and delivered to the gallery ready-made, just a cut slab or something like that, tastefully arranged around the gallery. And if you carved things and made things out of it, you were considered an illusionist. And as we all knew, the death of form was right around the corner. So I was getting bored as a sculptor. And at the same time in New York, in the early 70s when we moved there was a phenomenon going on the This is the phenomenon when we got there, was the big wave of youth culture before graffiti and before hip-hop was street gangs. And these were the notorious fighting gangs where they battled over territory throughout the city. The film The Warriors was made based on this culture. And it was a real thing. And, urban culture, street culture, and young people are very inventive. And, they had these artistic jackets that they wore with their symbols on it. They organized themselves in little bands of, modeled after national liberation movements, really, because consider it was 1970, and the Black Panthers and the Young Lords were out there, and the younger kids kind of modeled themselves on that and on the international movements for national liberation. So this was going on, and they were also very scary. There was, mugging was rampant in New York. People in general were afraid of the youth. Along about 1971, there was, a reaction amongst the kids themselves against the terrible violence, and there was a peace movement. And this is a picture of one of the citywide peace meetings that took place at that time. And the gangs more or less disappeared after this, and hip hop emerges as the popular culture form in New York. And what changed about it was that it was a much more peaceful movement. They were sick of the violence, and people could move around the city and get together across many divides, territorial divides, racial and cultural divides, so that black kids and Puerto Rican kids got together, white kids got together in the movement to some degree, and it was a new world. And at that point, we get to the city, and yeah, here it's the Ghetto Brothers. This was part of the new world. This gang was a fierce street gang, and now you see their symbol are garbage cans on the back of their shirt, meaning they would go around cleaning up the neighborhood. And of course, graffiti is kind of in its beginning stages there. This being a very early example of it, and it's territorial. It marks the Ghetto Brothers' territory. Much as in Los Angeles, all the way from the 60s, they were marking their territory with gang symbols. This is Chaz Bojorquez as a young man in front of one of his, which I can't read, but it is clearly a territorial thing. New York in the early 70s began with these small tags that people would put up to which they were personal. This was the big difference now between the gang era that preceded it. People put up graffiti which was about themselves. And it was usually about themselves as a nickname. You know, it's a new identity for the street. And of course the crown over it, meaning that they are king, self-appointed, no doubt, over the territory, over the city, or that they consider themselves the best artist. In fact, the crown is ubiquitous throughout the whole history of New York graffiti. And somebody had the bright idea of painting trains, you know, and New York has 600 miles of track that the subways run on, and going all over the city. So this again, out of the original sort of territorial youth culture, which had to do with gangs, where one kid couldn't go to another neighborhood without fear of being beaten up. Now they were going on the train all around the city, and it was beginning to break down these barriers. Of course, then somebody thought, well, my name would be much bigger if I did an outline and filled it in. And so gradually, the form begins to take shape, in the sense that what became what we know of as subway graffiti, and then later on graffiti on walls and murals in the New York style, this is evolving. And more an aesthetic component is becoming part of it. It becomes just as important to get up many times. It becomes just as important to get up with something beautiful. We were there, 1973 we moved there, and I didn't know my way around the city very much. I was taking the train back and forth to work in Manhattan, which is, you know, all the trains in Manhattan run underground as subways, and it's only in the outer boroughs that they come out on elevated tracks. Eventually I found my way to the outer boroughs, and I realized for the first time that, I can take pictures of these trains, which had been fascinating me since I began to ride the subways. I saw all this art evolving on it, and I thought, well, somebody should be taking pictures of it. But it took me several years to realize that you could actually take pictures of it if you went outside. So this is Intervale Avenue in the South Bronx. The South Bronx at the time was in the process of being burnt down, basically. I picked this spot because, all the trains, the most important lines ran through here. People painted on these lines for a variety of reasons, but one of the main reasons was because it's really the primary line in the city. It runs from Brooklyn to the Bronx, and there are several different numbers that run on here. The two line and the 5 line, and nearby the 4 line went, and there are local trains, the 3 line and the 1 line. So you could just about get everything through here. And another advantage of it was that the sun was behind me. I would stand on this platform in the morning, and the sun was behind me, and it would illuminate the artwork which came along in the trains here. So I began catching pictures like this. Of course, with a 50mm lens, you can't get everything in. So I eventually realized that if I took several pictures and spliced them together, I could get the full car. And this is what I ended up doing. It sort of became my format, where I could get good close-ups of the trains and splice them together in my studio, later on digitally like here, and have a really good view of these works of art. I've been digitalizing them and organizing them, putting them together for the last several years, and I have 800 or so of these painted trains, which, as Robert pointed out, have disappeared long since. Eventually, it was actually about 3 years of my taking pictures before I met an actual graffiti writer. And to get perspective on this, now of course graffiti writers are ubiquitous, as is this form. It's everywhere. And so it doesn't seem like an amazing thing to actually come across an underground culture and actually find your way into it, which is what I did. And one of the reasons why it was so hard for me, and I was always open to the idea, hoping I would meet graffiti writers, because I was curious and wanted to find out more about it. Of course, they saw me as a middle-aged white man, and therefore probably a cop. And so they didn't like come out and want to meet me. They said, watch out for that guy. Who knows what he's up to. So eventually, somebody also taking pictures on the platform, it was inevitable that we should just go and speak. And he said, I showed him pictures that I had taken. He was somewhat trusting. He said, if you want to meet everybody who does this, there's a bench, a particular station in the system where everybody goes after school. And so that was 149th Street in the South Bronx, right here. I went there, and indeed I found a number of artists whose work I had already documented. So that, for me, was my ticket inside. They continued to be suspicious of, well, I was just waiting to have the greatest bust of all as a cop, after getting to know everybody and then gathering them all together in one spot and then calling in reinforcements. But that never happened. So I gained their trust, and we had this arrangement, this relationship, which was based on my documenting their work, and they would give me in turn information, and it was a very useful relationship. And these, eventually I got to know many of them. This was my sculpture studio downtown, which was, downtown New York was the center of the art scene. It was Soho, the famous Soho, which at that time was full of artists and abandoned lofts, which has now become very glitzy and expensive real estate. So I like what it says at the bottom, looking at an invasion of art, which is exactly what was going on here. This was probably the first graffiti mural in Soho back in 1980. And it was not received well by my neighbors, partly because it meant that all these kids that they basically were afraid of came to visit me, and that was a problem. I was bringing down the tone of the neighborhood, they thought. These messages to me would appear on the subways, which I must say I didn't mind. Having gotten to know them and gotten to know how they work, I was amazed at that time that they carefully made working sketches beforehand, and that this was definitely a part of it. You can see how careful. This is the artist's name is Cos, C-O-S, and they used the character, which is kind of a self-portrait, in the middle to take the place of the O. They're all the colors of the paint that they used. The spray paints at that time had these colors, icy grape, fed purple, etc. So these are the colors that he had planned to use on this particular artwork. Of course, and this is actually in fulfillment, in realization, and I was lucky enough to catch the picture and to get the original outline. I had to go into the places where they painted, which was not something I really wanted to do, but I knew I had to do it, partly because I sort of had appointed myself as anthropologist, and therefore I had to really study every aspect of the culture. That was one reason. Another reason was there was another photographer named Martha Cooper who went into the yards with them numerous times, and I really, that was a challenge. I couldn't let that go unanswered. So this was in an outdoor yard where the trains were stored in Brooklyn. At that time, the yards were only surrounded by a chain link fence, which was easy to cut a hole into and easy to get in and out. That's no longer possible. In fact, about five years after this photo was taken, it was impossible to get in with such ease. This particular night, we did get chased by workers who were carrying pipes, and we ran out as fast as we could. We went to another place that same night in a tunnel underground, and I was given a spray can and told to say, "Here you go, give it a shot." So somebody was nice enough to do an outline for me, and I filled it in. But you can see, perhaps from the expression of my face, that I'm kind of overwhelmed with fear. It was scary to go in there, into the tunnels, and to crawl under the trains. Maybe this was parked 6 rows in. So we had to crawl under the trains, which means crawling over the third rail, which has only a board loosely sitting on top of the third rail. And then there are parts of the train which are as live with voltage as the third rail is. So you had to avoid these things as you crawled under it and over the rail and under the next train. So I did this very few times just to have the experience, and I survived. But just, that these kids do that, or were doing that at the time, this was part of the thing which made it, of course, attractive and exciting to them. And the fact that the police might chase them or the workers chase them. To have done something on the outside of the, to have accomplished a piece on the trains meant that you went through all this. So it was kind of a badge of honor for the kids. Who saw themselves basically like this, being nasty. And it's not without irony. Obviously, most of them are just school kids, but this was a boast for the benefit of their peers. Criminals invading again. And to get, the whole spirit of it, TNT, which was a graffiti crew, which the TNT stood for the nation's top. So TNT is every place, in your eyes and in your face, more or less gets the spirit of the whole thing. And people say, well, it's so aggressive. Well, yes, it is, no doubt. And others say, there's a big debate whether it's art or vandalism. And of course, it's both. But for the people who say, yes, it's art, you have to say yes, but there's this aggressive aspect of it, which, you know, in where, you know, my freedom will stop, like, close to your chin, kind of thing. How far do you go? And the picture is worth 1,000 words. So there is an aspect which is very appealing to me of graffiti as it was done on the trains in the 70s and 80s in New York, which is it's performance art in the sense that you only get one shot at it. You can rehearse it, but then you do your piece under these conditions, and your piece will run the next day, whether it turns out to be beautiful or if it looks terrible. And if it looks terrible, part of the activities within this culture were to go to the bench where I went to, the writer's bench, where I met everybody in that station, and in other stations around the city, to go there with your friends and watch it, watch the trains go by. And you would see maybe the piece that you did the night before, and then, you know, everybody, there was this gallery of people which would decide thumbs up or thumbs down. And it was very humiliating to be there when some horrible mess came through, that you, because you hadn't been able to crumple it up in your studio and throw it away before you showed it. It was there for all to see, so all these excuses popped up. That was one. I was high was another. Yeah, just a good piece by somebody named Terrible T-Kid. This of course is graffiti on a monument, and you know, for me, for my whole justification for documenting it and for speaking about it positively, I always run into the problem of what do you do when it goes someplace where you don't like it to be. Here, you know, granted, this is in a part of New York, which basically the city, because of many reasons of deferred maintenance and being a bankrupt city at the time, basically they abandoned their infrastructure, including their parks. And so, you know, it was up for grabs. When you see this, which is sort of the typical South Bronx scene, where the trains ran, where the people lived, where they could, you notice all the buildings there, the windows are vacant, they're abandoned, and the buildings here have been bulldozed, burned and bulldozed. The sort of northeastern cities of the United States at the time, this would be like late 70s, early 80s when I took this picture, had gone through a long decline, which was not just a natural process. It was helped along, in fact, you know, to a more or less extent, by decisions that people had made, that the people in authority had made, that our politicians had made. And they were on a federal level and on the local level. On the federal level, it was decided that it was better to invest in, you know, the development of the country as a whole and sort of to abandon the old Rust Belt cities. That there was more money to be made in general with the interstate highway system, with suburban development, the creation of malls and all of that goes along with it. And in fact, the economy of the United States for many, many years was driven by the development of real estate until very recently. And so this was going on, and at the urban level, you know, I mean, this is the South Bronx. One of the things which helped to kill it was a big highway plan that Robert Moses was developing. Robert Moses was was in charge of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. And in that position, he had a great deal of power over city planning. And his plan was to punch huge superhighways through densely populated old neighborhoods like the Bronx, which were viable neighborhoods in the 60s, 50s, and before. It took 10 years to build the Cross Bronx Expressway, which divided the neighborhood into people in the south part couldn't really go to where they used to shop, where they used to go to the library, and basically they left. And they left also because there was this gigantic, noisy, dusty, rat-inspiring project going on in their midst. So that's one reason why the Bronx was abandoned. And landlords were left holding the bag. They had these buildings that they couldn't sell. They milked them as long as they could with ever lower prices for their apartments, rentals. And when they couldn't get any more out of them, they would hire some, gang kids to torch the place, arson. They burned their buildings and they got their insurance out of it. It's not coincidental that the 1982 was the year that the no-fault insurance rule was abandoned, and that same year the fires more or less stopped. So that's what was going on here. And when people, at this time there was a big campaign against graffiti, of course, and there was a whole notion that it was a terrible crime. And I have to say that compared to this vast devastation which took place, partly as a result of human interventions, human decisions, and often human scheming, there were real estate interests who wanted to get control of all of this land, so they were happily colluding with the local authorities who were, during this time, closing fire stations and saying, well, for budgetary reasons, we close the fire stations. At the same time, they were reducing the amount of, the number of times that the garbage people would come and pick up. All those things they were taking away and encouraging the decline of the city. So those have always been my answers to people saying, yeah, but graffiti is destructive. And okay, but back to the monument, where I started, before I started on this digression. My wife and I visit Italy frequently, and we go to Rome, and I see, graffiti all over the travertine marble and the beautiful sort of ochre walls of the city, and I go, oh God, I take some blame and responsibility for helping that along, and obviously I don't like it. But for the same reason, and this is a much broader discussion, and I certainly don't know the answer, but why are people doing graffiti? And what is it that adolescents seem to need that society in general is not coming up with? There's a problem out there, and graffiti is just a symptom of that. So that's something very interesting to address, which I don't have a good answer for here. But I will say that in this pair of photographs, I'll go back and forth between them. Here's the playground, the vacant lot. Here's the equipment, old mattresses in bricks, and everything rusty and sharp. And these kids they're creating something beautiful out of very little. They're using what they have. And this, to me, has always been the spirit of graffiti as an art form, and hip-hop, breakdancing, all these forms that during this period of much hardship back in that era, about 30 years ago, were able to achieve. And this is a good symbol of it. This is a little group of it's a DJ and his MCs in East Harlem, again in a vacant lot like that. And of course the block parties that they had by tying the electricity into the lamppost in the playground, bringing out all their equipment, and having basically DJ events, which were often battles. They're often very competitive because, much like the graffiti and the breakdancing, the whole music scene was very competitive. And you had all these records that you'd bring to it. You always covered the labels with something covering what the label was, so that your competitors couldn't see what you were actually using to create your beats. You built your gigantic speakers, and you played your music, and if there was somebody at the other end of the playground who had their speakers, but if the crowd came to you, you were the one who were winning. And of course, breakdancing is highly competitive sport. And entirely invented by kids, and out of a long continuum, really, of African and Afro-Caribbean culture, this dance comes from. Was graffiti, New York style graffiti, ever political? And of course, only occasionally it was. And it's the same story with rap. When it first began, it really was about having fun. It was about having a good party. And, outsiders, like myself and others, would say, boy, this is a wonderful medium for saying something important. Everybody's just talking about a party. And with the graffiti artist, it's just the name. There's this incredible evolution of style and aesthetic development which took place. But for the most part, it's just putting up a person's name. And so, so what? Why not use it for something more important? Messages, just like, art in general, and important public art. It's really has wonderful potential as public art. And of course, as we've seen, street art really has played that role as it's evolved, kind of on a parallel development along with graffiti. And it's now taken precedent, I think, in the world because it has a lot of content. It has great potential for content, and people are using it that way. Of course, this was one of the few graffiti trains that had some comment about American power and imperial tendencies around the world. This was in the era of, freeing South Africa was still something to be done, and Central America in the early 80s. This was during the second Iraq War, during the George W. Bush War. There were a few murals that came up, even in the United States, I'll say. Stop the war. This was one that was commenting on drug addiction in the city. You can't see it very well, but those little figures starting from the right side are shooting up and nodding out with drugs, collapsing sick. Up to the left side, there's somebody reaching, triumphantly pointing at this BMX biker. And the BMX, is a very skillful sport to master all the moves that you can do with these bikes. And he's in a gas mask in a toxic environment, but leaping over it all, travailing. So There's one of the, that mural is by Lee Quinones, who was one of the great graffiti artists from the 70s and 80s. And he still has a career as a fine artist. This is another one of his pieces. It's a helicopter, an American helicopter in Southeast Asia. And they would have an art show on the siding in these communities. And one year they invited me to curate an exhibit on the outside of these trains with New York graffiti artists. This is about 1986, I think. So I gathered together about 8 talented graffiti artists to come and do this. And the director of the museum came to me, and I've got this backwards, excuse me. All right, the director of the museum came to me, and he said, you have to tell the artist that he can't depict a spray can. And I said, I don't understand. Why? He said, children, schools are going to visit these exhibitions as they go around the country. We can't have children seeing that. And I said, that's crazy. I said, I'm not gonna do that. I'm not going to tell the artist to take it out. But he took it upon himself to ask the artist to remove the can, this terrible symbol, from the painting. And he complied. But this, this brings up to me, it seems to me there's this big debate amongst graffiti artists, always has been, from the moment that the commercial aspect came into play. About 1980, the art world finally got, postmodernism came into being. The modernism was dead, and now you were going to be able to look at art by children, outsider art, all sorts of other manifestations, which were much more expressive than what had been taking place during late modernism with its minimalism and conceptual art. So this kind of thing, the debate started to take place among graffiti writers that if you did legal art, or with permission, you were a sellout. And the only valuable, that it wasn't any more graffiti, the only valuable art to be done was illegal. You choose your spot, you do it when you want to. Nobody tells you what to do. So my answer to that, along with this picture, is to say, well, there's another level at which you're going to have to fight. And this is the one sort of universal level of freedom of expression and of negotiation with authorities, with other people that have their interests too, and working it out that way. This is a new playing field. So we get to the point where, here's some examples of street art. I think this is one of the most eloquent takes on what was a horrifying and iconic picture from the Vietnam era of that child running down the street, burning napalm. And Banksy, famous street artist from Britain, has created this, which is just, the two iconic symbols of America for happiness, the McDonald's and Mickey Mouse, bringing along this child, is a very powerful, forceful expression, and probably would be terribly offensive to other people if it turned up on their neighborhood walls. And there probably a battle would ensue over what is appropriate to be put on walls. But it's a great new conversation, not so new, but it's going to be very interesting. Another Banksy piece. And of course, these couple of photos borrowed from William Parry, who did a series of photographs of the Israeli wall with messages like this. So I'm very, the more, to me, after 30 years of looking at graffiti with people's names, I'm finally unable to even see it. It blurs together in my vision. I'm very excited about the development that is taking place, that street art is becoming much more and more prominent, and a lot of graffiti artists who started out writing their names now are incorporating thoughts, feelings, and messages in their work. And there's Chaz Bohorquist I showed at the beginning as a young man. He's still at it. I was in Albuquerque a couple of months ago participating in a street art event, and he was there. That's him from the 60s. But one of the wonderful developments that I was, not a development, but what I came across in Albuquerque, I was fully expecting to see the usual suspects of Banksy and Los Jameos and the prominent street artists around the world. But what was also there were some local artists, Native Americans from the New Mexico pueblos, who are very talented and who are now presenting their own culture through this form of expression, which is very exciting to see. They're doing beautiful work. Here's the crew. That's the main artist is the guy with the beads. Second from right is Jake Fragua, and these are his concepts. That's his crew that he paints with. Another really interesting artist that I met in New Mexico was Chip Thomas, who's an African-American doctor who went to northern Arizona to work on the reservation after, to pay off his debt to the government loans that he got to become a doctor. And while on the reservation, he began to take pictures, and he's started to blow them up large. He takes his photographs, he divides them into grids and takes them to Kinko's, and does the largest paper that he can use there, and then comes back and puts them up on walls. And this is a picture that he took of one of his works that he put up on these water towers on the reservation. Now, just 2 weeks ago, I was in Birmingham and in Coventry in the UK. I was invited to come there by an artist named Muhammad Ali, Aerosol Arabic, and he is a young man from, his parents were from South Asia, and he was born in the UK and grew up there. But he started out writing graffiti as a kid and has evolved into a mural artist. That's him. So as he states here, one of his inspirations is Malcolm X, and another is Gandhi. And he wants to. The Malcolm X part is for resistance and for people in marginal communities to stand up and be heard. Which is that one? There's a picture of Malcolm X. And these are some examples of the work that he'd done in Birmingham. Free Gaza. So, at this point, if anybody has any questions, I put together a little 20-minute video while I was in Birmingham with Muhammad Ali, going around and talking with him, and he has some interesting things to say, and I'd like to show that. I would also like to entertain some questions at this point, if you all have any, before going on to the video. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
we have a mic here that
Oh, good.
can
Good.
circulate.
Yeah. And I'll shout.
No, I guess you'll bring it back. We only have
Okay.
one mic. Yeah. Okay. Jimmy will get lots of exercise.
But I can also move closer.
Hello. Is this working? First of all, thank you very much. Really interesting. One of the things that strikes me, especially the first series that you showed of just the trains. I was in New York in the late 70s and early 80s, and I'm sure I saw those trains, but I never saw those trains.
Yeah.
In the sense that all I saw was mess. You know, you went down to the subway and it was just chaos, and it was, you know, it was crazy. And there's the process in which your photographs distill out the art of it. So, you know, I saw that, but I didn't see that as a whole. You framed it in a particular way.
Yeah.
And that's, in a sense, what turns it, that's what makes, I think, all of us here able to look at it and say, wow, that's fantastic. Whereas had we been there at the time, we would have said, oh, that's, you know, well, why did these kids do that kind of vandalism? So I think part of the question is, did you have that sort of global in framed vision right from the start, or did the photographs surprise even you once you had taken them?
Okay, Jimmy, you can give him the mic back. Sorry, we only have one mic. Usually we have a couple. Sorry.
I think I was, as a newcomer to New York, I wasn't jaded, and I think that I was able to filter out a lot of the very, and the bad stuff didn't bother me, because New York at the time was exciting largely because it was chaotic and a mess, and anything would happen in a day, and sometimes it was dangerous, but you always had the sense that on any given day, you didn't know what was going to happen, and that was part of me. Of course, I heard that a lot when I took them out of context and I put them on a wall of a gallery or in a book. People would say, I had no idea, you know, and that's true. But I was watching, and while I was writing, and I was seeing these amazing things, and so you know, that was my motivation. Yes. Yeah. This is my wife.
Sorry. I just wanted to say that the color on this screen isn't very good, and so all the reds have been taken out. So in order to actually see what these pictures look like, come to see the film, and or find a copy of the book, because while this is remarkable, that about half the color spectrum is missing from these photographs.
Thank you. Yeah.
I just like to say I was there at the time, and I thought they were fantastic, and I couldn't understand what all the fuss was about, because it really brightened up one's journey, because the subway was so awful. When one of these trains came through, it was a pleasure. So I didn't have the same reaction at all. I was more in your spectrum, and you're right about the colours.
Yeah, given the state of the transit at the time, it was a real mess. The graffiti was actually the fun part.
I thought they enhanced the experience.
Yes, it enhanced the experience. And I think you're right. I think, except the insides, which only if you were a complete, you know, fanatic about graffiti, and so you recognized the names of who was there and who they were and everything, then it was something of a pleasure to write. Otherwise, it was a real mess. One of the kids from then, I interviewed more recently, and he talked about how his father had been a printmaker, and so he had learned from his father all about mixing inks and things like that, and he had access to vats of inks, and he created markers out of like orange juice cans stuffed with rags that he would then dip into this stuff and, you know, drippy mess, and the inside that was pretty bad. And he said he used to go in at night to the trains, pour a jar of ink on the seats. You know, the seats are kind of dip like that. So he'd have an inkwell all along the inside, and he would dip this marker in and write his name. So, I understand the problematic part of it. But what's also interesting is that the transit authority in the city, in order to combat graffiti, they decided to clean the outsides, which had these beautiful murals on them. And the idea was that by doing that, they would discourage the kids from painting. And they couldn't address the inside, so they didn't address the inside. So they chose this sort of symbolic war to wage. We will destroy your artwork.
I never understood why they didn't call off. It would have made more sense.
Yeah, it would have. They were afraid that they'd lose control. And they would have lost control. But still, I agree with you that it would have been much more of a dialogue between the kids and the authorities if they had tried to co-opt. So,
And that's the more of attrition.
yeah.
Do we have more questions?
There's a
Yes.
urban legend or something that you had to steal the paint cans to be authentic. Is that true?
Well, you had to steal the paint cans just to paint, because there was no way that a kid on an adolescent sort of allowance was going to be able to come up with that kind of money to buy your paint.
And it was illegal to buy paint if you were under 18.
It became illegal. It wasn't at the beginning, but after a number of years, if you were under 18, you couldn't buy paint. But yeah, there's a mystique about stealing paint. You became, as adolescents are, you were an outcast if you were such a wimp as you had to go out and buy it, or you were a rich kid and you bought it, and everyone went, you had the part of the badge of honor part was that yes, you had to go through that whole process of stealing paint. So it happened. It doesn't happen anymore. It's interesting that part of the mystique has been dropped because it was just so impossible for people finally to do that much stealing. It's interesting in the era of decline in New York and in the northeastern United States, it was also very easy to steal. Yes.
No, you can just hold the mic. I think people can hear me. First, I was also in New York during this period, and I must say I didn't really get it until I think the mayor of Beijing came when Ed Koch invited him. He just loved them, and Koch went, "No, it's terrible," and that was when I got it. I went, "Oh, of course, you have to have it, So to a certain extent, I wasn't as awake as she was, but maybe, but there was a moment when the light went on. The question I have has to do with there was one of the political pieces flashed quickly that reminded me a little bit of Diego Rivera. And one thing that's always fascinated me about the relationship between Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera is that he painted for the future, for utopia and these big political things, and she painted her body herself, and he's virtually forgotten. People don't really even know who he is, I think, certainly, whereas all over the world Frida Kahlo is me, my body and me, or whatever, and I just wonder the extent to which this participates at all in any sort of those traditions, and the Mexican muralists.
Mm-hmm. You mean the grand idea and the personal?
Yeah.
Yeah. I will say this also brings up the issue of women in the graffiti movement, and it was of course a boys' club, very much so. Largely because there are women who did it, and they're rare, because I think in general the whole testosterone thing means that adolescent boys will be testing themselves to do crazy, dangerous things, and not so much women. And it was problematic for girls to go in with a crew late at night, and we'd have to, and the ones who did it, they say quite frankly, yeah, we did it to test our macho side, but it was very dangerous for them in hell, and with these bands of adolescents, it wasn't very safe for them. So. Wait, I really haven't addressed Robert's question sufficiently. And I'm not sure that, in something which was always about the name, you know, that's the dichotomy. Do you do your name, or do you do scenery and messages and things like that? And about a handful of maybe 4 artists from this graffiti scene ever did anything more ambitious. Well, it was all ambitious, but more sort of narrative in content than just putting your name and developing your style. The idea of something sort of Frida Kahlo-like on subway graffiti, I don't think I recall anything like that. Yes, there was one over here. Yeah. You want to speak to this?
Lena from graphic art.
Not architecture. No, first I'm amazed at how young they are, the ones who are doing it at the time. And I'm wondering if there's this relation, Banksy and so on were not that young. Are they more mature and therefore looking for another form of expression rather than just tagging their name? And the other thing was the involvement you said, okay, it was all about the name and it aesthetically developed, but then there's also the political statements that are starting to show up and more personalized, whatever expression. But there's also the animated graffiti where they take them as stop motion, where they explore the space and not just the surface. There's also very interesting and also has a lot.
Are you thinking of blue?
Blue.
Yeah, I love blue. Amazing.
You see, I mean, what do you think of that? It going into that direction?
I love it. You know, I really do. I think that finally, there's this great movement of using this medium for all of its potential, and that's happening. As far as their being so young, that's true. They start at 13, and originally they finish at 18, because at 18 the penalties are severe. And they inhaled, but they didn't know, and it was only later that came out that it was really dangerous. But once it hit 1980 in the gallery scene, people stuck with it because they saw in it, those who did, they saw in it, potential for a future career, and that's how it's worked out. I mean, the police are fond of saying that graffiti is an entry-level crime, and in my experience, that of course that's happened, but wouldn't they have been criminals anyway? I always have to say. And the other thing is that these kids found through their apprenticeship on writing on trains, very often, because they experience what they don't experience in school, which is dedication, love of excellence, because they chose it for themselves. And they learned through that what hard work that you have to do, the preparation that you have to do. If you love something enough, you'll do it. And they've gone on to have careers as artists or filmmakers or, magazine publishers and that kind of thing. Yeah. So, if there are no questions, you may have some later. I'd like to show, it's a 20-minute film of this guy that I met in Britain, and we participated in the show, Is Graffiti Going to Change the World?
Broadcasting to the city of Birmingham, a weekly show which is bringing forward activists, photographers, filmmakers to the city of Birmingham across 93.5 FM, and also on unityfm.net. You can hear the show. And my name is Muhammad Ali, Harrison Arabic.
So Birmingham's your home.
That's right.
Oh,
Yeah.
FM.
Certainly has, yeah. You know, I was born and raised in the city of Birmingham. Britain's second city. You know, my father settled here many years ago in the 60s. For me, the city of Birmingham is something that's quite close to my heart, really. You know, it's like, this is the place that I know, this is the streets that I know. Any other city, you know, I can't feel the streets. You know, I can't feel the city, really, but this city, you know, just driving in these areas where I am now, you know, I have memories. You know, I went to school, you know, just here, you know, in this neighborhood. You know, moving to England, or moving into Western countries, I guess, as an opportunity to, you know, either make some money and build some financial stability for their families, for their kids, and have a life, I suppose. So that's one of the reasons why my father moved to the UK. He wasn't born here, and you know, I was born here. You know, so my father might have had a very different kind of outlook to myself. You know, my father perhaps was more like, you know, he's a visitor to this country. He wouldn't see this as ultimately his home. You know. Whereas me, you know, I was born and raised here. I mean, we'd go for kind of family trips back to the homeland, you know, this whole thing. But for me, this is home. You know, I don't know anywhere else really. You know, and growing up in the UK, in England, in certainly some times where, you know, racism was rife. You know, in the 80s and 90s, you know, experiencing that racism that was kind of very, very, you know, the difficult times in England, as race riots and skinheads, you know, National Front, all of this kind of stuff. But, you know, having gone through that, and obviously now things are much better in some ways in terms of racism. You know, you won't get spat at on the street, you won't get sworn at openly like you would have, like I remember when I was a kid. You know, things have evolved, you know, people have accepted, and Britain has certainly changed. You know, the face of Britain, you know, has changed over the past few decades, you know what I'm saying? I mean, it's like England is a melting pot, you know, now, and it's not the kind of the Shakespearean England that perhaps some people have this romantic kind of vision of. The most popular name in the country, there's a survey done in the UK, and the most popular name was Mohammed. You know?
Yeah. Not John or Joe.
Yeah, it used to be Jack. Jack was number one.
Yeah.
But Jack got knocked off, yeah. And now Jack is gone, and now Mohammed's number one. This is the canal side. Yeah. So a lot of people in Birmingham would be proud of the fact that we have more canals here in Birmingham. There are more canals in Birmingham than there are in Venice. You can see this wall here. I mean, it's totally kind of battered at the moment. I can see some of the colours that I had a piece from here from many years ago. But this has been years and years tagged. You can see it's kind of sandblasted down that one point as well. In fact, so the city council, just like any city, you can see where they attempted to blast it off. Yeah. So you know, the city authorities. And here, you know, on the other side, I think they're trying to clean that. I know they haven't. That side hasn't been cleaned because during the winter, when the canals are iced over, people obviously just walk across the ice. I got into it quite early. In fact, I'm only 32, and people say, "You're too. You can't surely remember the early days. You're too young. You know, you have to kind of be about 38, 39, right?" Because I had an older brother, and my brother who's in his 40s now, right? Yeah. He was the one who rushed out to buy Subway Art, and I was probably 7 or 8 years old, maybe 7 years old, 6, something like that. But I still remember 6, 7 years old. My brother, this book, getting into graffiti hardcore. You know, he got into graffiti. I remember the police knocking on the door and saying, "Come, you know, they found out and then give him some paint and then made him paint it out." You know, but this is the old days where now you just get arrested and you'd be locked up and you've had some kind of criminal charge. That's how I got into it, as a kind of a little kid, just kind of watching and curiously watching what my brother was doing. And then whenever the book was around, somewhere I'm kind of sneaking a look and going, "Whoa, look at this." It must have been about 10, 11 years old, 9, 10, 11 years old, something like that, where I was actually going around and kind of putting my name and things in places, you know. Only in the local kind of neighborhood in the park or whatever. Yeah, so it all started off really as a kind of an obsession, just watching my brother, and then you just have a normal job and whatever. And I'd say the majority of people, that was the case. I think everybody could say, "Yeah, I remember graffiti, we used to do it." But how many people say, you know, "I still do it in 2010, you know?" And it is that minority, I think, of people who kind of the hardcore who said, you know, we couldn't shake it off. This became our lives, and it still is our lives. In about 5 seconds, about 5 seconds, you should have it. After this building, there's another building, and then there's an open space. I'll slow down for you. Okay, here we go. You know, I find the amazing thing, when I'm painting a wall, I'm competing with billboard companies because where I want to communicate to the widest number of people as possible, billboard companies are doing the same. So we're almost always in the same space. And sometimes the contrasting message of what I've got communicating and what they're communicating, it's like, my God, they're kind of seeing that contrast. It's quite striking sometimes. I mean, now I just looked up at the latest billboard on the side of our building, you know, the hub and what the hub stands for in terms of, you know, spirits, a social, often spiritual message. And here we have an advert for a lady draped in a fur coat. And in fact, it's sometimes really quite striking and powerful. We're talking about spiritual and the center being about spirituality and art that reflects that. And we have OMG, oh my God. You know, it's quite powerful because it's a statement in itself. When you see that billboard alongside what we're doing, it's almost, and for me, that is doing what I'm aiming to do, which is offer an alternative. So you have that billboard message saying, have this lovely fur coat, or this latest aftershave, and you know, the latest PlayStation game. But I'm also giving something else alongside that billboard. I'm going to say to people, how about think about this as well? You don't see this anywhere else. You don't see it on television or in the magazines or in, you know, on the, you know, internet. You won't see that. You will come across everything else, and they will push towards all of this. But I'm trying to present something alongside it as an alternative to people and say, listen, don't feel that this is all there is to life. You know, I want to give you something else to think about, which you are not guided towards in any other way. Switch on the television, you're pushing you towards this thing. Well, I'm saying, no, look guys, have you thought about this? Have you thought about death? Have you thought about freedom and justice and people who are dying on the other side of the world? People are suffering. People can't even get a glass of water, like you can just turn the tap. There's one reason, very, very, very simple for me. There's one reason why I stopped illegal graffiti. And I'd be still doing it today otherwise. And it isn't because it's against the law. Yeah, maybe that has something to do with it. Maybe. I've stopped for one reason alone. The law and the punishments and the penalties for graffiti couldn't stop me, and that was not enough to stop me. And like many kids, it wasn't enough. The one thing that stopped me doing it was my religion, my faith. Learning and understanding my religion more so, and becoming absorbed and more guided in life by the principles of Islam as a religion. I realized that as someone who believes in my Creator and lived a life as a Muslim, I realized it's not allowed for me to do so, even in the eyes of God. In the Islamic faith, there was saying of the Prophet Muhammad, love for your brother what you wish for yourself, what you love for yourself. And this is echoed in the Christian tradition, love thy neighbor as thyself. It became very simple to me when I started to see tags on the side of kind of my neighbor's home, not my home, but my neighbor was on a corner, so his wall was always getting tagged, and I thought, you gotta love what you love for yourself, what you love for your neighbor. If I can tag a wall and vandalize someone's property and see no problem in that, but then someone does it to your own self, no one would like that if someone tagged your front door and made your house covered in tags, surely? So it's a very simple principle. This totally, you have to try to be altruistic in the sense that you got to think of your others, and when you start to understand and respect the people, respect your community, respect your society, ultimately I think it comes automatically and organically where you realize, I can't tag that because that's someone's property here. That's another human being that is going to have to come out in the cold with a roller and paint it off. I've seen it. I've seen poor old ladies there with, painting their walls out. And I've driven past and I've thought, my God, look at that poor old lady having to paint the work. It wasn't city authorities or whatever. But I saw a poor old lady doing so. And then you think, no, you know what? It's very simple, really. However, when you vandalize city authorities, an ugly factory building or whatever it might be, there's no doubt you think, wow, that's not a big deal. In fact, to be honest, when I was doing it back in the day and I was bombing in that sense, I actually used to see it as a good deed I was doing, because I used to see the ugliest wall in town and putting a bit of colour on there. I would be like, the city authorities don't come out and paint these walls nice and white like they would in some neighbourhoods. And there was tags covered with tags and tags and tags. So I would find the ugliest wall just completely caned with tags, and I would go and I'm doing something, even if it might not be with permission. But I was putting some colour on there because I said, look, you know what? I'm going to decorate the town. If no one else is going to enhance this, I'm going to do that. So in those times, I never really felt like I was doing a bad deed as such, because, for me, real beauty is not something which is inherently beautiful, but something which is ugly, and then you transform the ugliness into beauty. That is real beauty, when you transform something into something beautiful. That's our role, I say, that we want to, or should aim to, transform our society, our condition that we live in, the ugliness that exists in the world, in our gallery itself that we set up. Upstairs people used to be getting drunk and high, and all over the car park. People were just hanging around, and it was a horrible environment. It really was. Even the neighbours, people used to kind of like complain about them because there were so many drunks hanging around. Now we transformed this space into something which is positivity, and in fact, bringing the gallery into this community, there's a reason why. For me, I'm hoping that the energy that almost radiates from the space upstairs, I want it to really kind of have an impact on the surroundings. I want people to know that, you know what, you can't go and smoke weed there, right? Yeah. You can't hang around outside there, because you know what, that's that place where, it's like a mosque almost, So having this gallery here in Sparkbrook in Birmingham, this big blue building, this is something to give back to the people. So we set this space up, and some of the world-class talent we've had. We've had renowned calligraphers here, and for example, calligraphy, which is of course something that any graffiti artist can appreciate, and the power of words and calligraphy and beautiful writing. So we had a master of Chinese stroke Arabic calligraphy, Haji Nuruddin. He does this fusion of Chinese and Arabic into one. So you can see on the right here, it's kind of Arabic but written in a kind of a Chinese style. And we did this we had a whole lot of people just watching this demonstration. And it's kind of unusual for them, they come to see, they're walking past the gallery, and then suddenly you see this master of Chinese calligraphy in this community. You know, we bought it from China, yeah, and it was like, whoa, you know. He's not in a kind of a gallery in the most glitzy part of town. We said, no, we were bringing meaningful people to the people in the places that you wouldn't expect. And that's the beauty of it, you know. In some ways, I'm kind of saying, you know what, the big galleries and the big art mainstream places, they can't get them, we can get them. Because we have a connection with the people, we have a connection with real artists, real activists, people who actually want to kind of strike at the grassroots, people who want to make that real connection as opposed to a kind of a tokenistic, you know, kind of connection as opposed to a statement. For many years, I've wondered as to why graffiti was never really, you never saw influences from other cultures, you know, Arabic and read Arabic and, you know, read the Quran since I was a kid. Seeing the letters and the script of Quranic script, Arabic script, I often wondered why did anyone not incorporate that. So when I started to play with the Arabic script, immediately I was just like, wow, you know, this is something quite powerful here. And I've always searched, and for years I've always searched the internet and looked around to see if there's anything going on, and I used to never come across anything. You know, I'm talking about 10, 15 years ago, I used to search, to look around. I used to be curious as to the graffiti scene in China and in Taiwan and places like this, hoping to see something which was not the American style of graffiti, and I would never see much. But it is refreshing to see, more so recently now, that there's a scene in Lebanon, and I've been following as well, actively. Whenever I hear about people doing graffiti other than they get it done in English and using Arabic script, now for me, that excites me for sure. You know, it makes me, gives me some refreshment that, you know, yes, things are changing, things are happening now. People are actually proud of the script and actually doing something relevant to them. When I hear about Palestine and the expressions upon the wall there, I think this is nice to see, not just your typical b-boy characters and the bling that you might see within some of the graffiti in the West. You know, it's refreshing not to see that in the Arab world. So that's what we are. I'm trying to almost promote us as a hub for world-class talent, bringing them to this space. And hub actually pronounce hope in Arabic. It has a double meaning in that hope means love in Arabic. So it's a hub, but it's hope. And you know, love being a kind of I guess, represents what our aims are, you know, trying to spread a bit of love in the world today and in the community here, bringing people together, because people have stepped foot in our space that have probably never ever come to this neighborhood ever. And that's the great thing. How do you really reach out to people and bring people into one space? Shall I explain the cameras on this side to you? I might as well.
Oh yes. I read the article, yes.
Oh, you saw that, yeah? This has become an iconic image, yeah, even that in a national newspaper. The CCTV cameras spray painted kind of discreetly into the design, yeah. And this really came about because in this very neighborhood where we're standing, it's predominantly Muslim, all different races, Somali, Asian, Arabs, Yemenis. So, unfortunately, the city authorities, there's this big national kind of scandal of how the local police authorities installed £3.2 million worth of CCTV cameras in this area, watching the people. Now, their claim was that it's for crime, reducing crime, but it actually came out that the funding that was allocated for these cameras came from an attempt to try and tackle extremism, terrorism. So, these cameras placed in Muslim neighborhoods to deal with terrorism, there was an outrage both in the Muslim community and in the non-Muslim community that you're spying on a community. This is not going to tackle the problem. This will just, exacerbate the situation, because people feel that they're being spied on because they are of Muslim faith. And these cameras they're everywhere. They hadn't been activated yet, fortunately. And campaigners got together. I sprayed these cameras in. There's this whole protest against it. the surveillance of these cameras watching the people, eventually the people won because the cameras are coming down. £3.2 million worth of wasted money, right?
One of the amazing, wonderful benefits for me of having done this whole graffiti thing is I've had this incredible passport, for 20 years, to go to different countries and go to places where I never ever would have been invited in to hang out with them otherwise. It's just been great, and this is one I've just recently visited, and I will be visiting more. But I've been all over Europe certainly, and also Mexico, and all around the United States. Just totally welcomed into these kind of underground communities, which also are a way of leading me into where people live and getting to meet people in different places. And it's just been great.
Thank you. Please, everyone.